two innermost planets. See, they're stirring up some complicated distribution in the gas disk. And then after that collision between the two inner planets, the planetary system will be stable, but the planetary orbits will no longer be circular. As you can see here, they're being illustrated. They've become somewhat eccentric as a result of those gravitational scattering encounters between the planets. So this is a good way of producing eccentric orbits starting from circular orbits coming out of the initial planet formation process. And here you end up with a stable planetary system. You can integrate this planetary system for billions of years forward into the future, and nothing further will happen to it. So you can do those kind of calculations very many times. Of course, the process is chaotic, so each individual time you try it, you'll get a different answer. And you can ask whether the statistical distribution you get is consistent with what we see in giant extrasolar planetary systems. And with some caveats, it is pretty consistent with what we see. So what you're looking at here is a comparison of the cumulative distribution of planetary eccentricity. And the circles here in this cumulative plot at the bottom are what is observed in giant extrasolar planetary systems. And this green curve here is what you get from these kind of scattering experiments, as long as you assume that the planets start this process, they start scattering, and in some cases relatively close to the star, as close as 1 AU away from the star. If you do that, you can get quite a good match to what is seen for the exoplanet eccentricity distribution. You can also look at what happens to planets that are scattered onto very eccentric orbits that would get close to their star and eventually have tidal interactions with the star, which would circularize their orbits and bring them into very small scales. So those planets are the ones that often have the inclined orbits that are not in the equatorial plane of the stellar rotation. And here, this red curve is showing the inclination distribution that is produced from these kind of calculations. And what you see is that although relatively low inclinations are fairly common, there is this tail which extends out past the polar orbiting planets into the retrograde planets, again consistent with what we see. So, does this mean that this kind of sort of violent scattering process is taking place in all giant extrasolar planetary systems? Well, certainly it doesn't. Those other processes I mentioned, which were shown on that earlier slide, almost certainly must be occurring in some of those planetary systems as well. But generally, it does sort of point to the idea that in these giant extrasolar planetary systems, their early evolution was much more violent than what probably happened in the solar system. So in the solar system, for whatever reason, the giant planets don't seem to have had these very large excursions in eccentricity and inclination, which are relatively common, it seems, in extrasolar planetary systems. Now, there are then some other planetary systems that we observed that pose some different puzzles. I mentioned that the sweet spot for giant planet formation is maybe between a few AU and out to 10 or 20 AU away from the star. And most of the extrasolar planets we've seen fall either within that region or they're closer to their star than that distance. However, there are a few other examples. Here's the most famous one. This is HR system known as HR 8799, and this is actually a directly imaged planetary system where actually we've really been able to make an image of the planetary orbits and observe at least a small arc of the planetary orbits over time. So there are 4 planets in this system. They're all massive. They may be 5 or 10 times the mass of Jupiter. But the striking thing is that they're also very far from their star. So this distance between the star and these outermost planets is maybe 50, 60, or 70 AU. So it's well outside the region where we would expect giant planets to form. So we really don't know what is going on with this kind of system. It's difficult, very difficult, to imagine forming these massive planets at those large scales, simply because before we got to these masses, we would expect those planets to be very readily ejecting material from the planetary system rather than accreting it. So this remains a puzzle. One possibility is that this system is the first example of a completely different channel of giant planet formation, which would occur not from, first of all, forming a solid core and then accreting the gas, but rather taking the gas disk and having it fragment directly into giant planets. So this is a process that we and many other people have looked at. So here you're looking at a massive disk that would be gravitationally unstable to forming planets, and at some point, I think about here, you'll see an object starts to contract out of the gas disk in this numerical simulation. And so this is predicted to be inevitable if you have protoplanetary disks that are both massive enough and extend out to large enough distances from their star. However, it's very uncertain whether that actually makes planets, or whether instead it makes more massive objects called brown dwarfs, which are effectively failed stars. The basic problem is that if you form a planet in one of these massive gas disks, it will tend to accrete gas very readily, and so it will often overshoot the 5 or 10 Jupiter masses that you'd like to make, say, to make HR 8799. So there's puzzles about this. Possibly we're looking at seeing a new mode of planet formation. Alternatively, perhaps, the cores of these planets that are seen actually formed at smaller scales and were somehow moved outwards and accreted their gas only when they reached large distances from their stars. So here we need more data, and as many of you know, one of the big things that people are trying to do with Subaru, Gemini, the VLT, is to develop instruments able to directly image planetary systems, and these large planetary systems, large distances from the star, are the ones that we have the best chance of seeing in the near future. Okay, so those are giant planets. What about terrestrial exoplanets? And I think the basic picture that I have, at least for the terrestrial exoplanets, can maybe be described as that there are several different modes of terrestrial exoplanet formation. So one possibility is clearly the possibility that seems to make sense in the solar system, so I call that the solar system-like mode of terrestrial planet formation, where the final assembly of the terrestrial planets, the final assembly of the Earth, takes a relatively long period of time. So in the Earth, both from simulations, both from theory, and also from dating the age of the Moon, we think that the final assembly of the Earth took something like 100 million years. So crucially, that is longer than the time that the gas in the protoplanetary disk survives around a young star. So the final assembly in that case occurs in a gas-free environment. So the solar system mode is slow. It occurs with the material basically remaining in place where it was formed in the planetary system, and it's not very strongly affected by the giant planets as long as the giant planets are reasonably well separated in orbital radius. Now, I think there's then possibly two other modes of terrestrial planet formation. One is controlled by the giant planets, so that would be occurring in those exoplanet systems where the giant planets perhaps have violent scattering interactions amongst each other, and then there may be a third mode where the formation of terrestrial planets occurs earlier, and therefore the material is subjected to gas effects and can move around radially to different distances from the star. So let me show you some examples of what we've been doing to try to understand those different modes. So let's first of all think about this giant-dominated mode. So here we've been looking at terrestrial planet formation in a system with 3 giant planets, where these 3 giant planets are going to be on unstable orbits. So again, we have distance from the star, eccentricity, color coding of the terrestrial planet region with the amount of water fraction of the material there. This is the calculated spectral energy distribution, which we don't need to worry about. So if you look at what happens here, it starts off very much like the solar system. Here are the giant planets. They're orbiting fairly stably. You can see there's growth occurring in the terrestrial planet region, and there's some mixing of the water-rich material from the outer part to the inner part. So it looks like we're in good shape to form a planetary system, something like the solar system. But then we're going to slow this down. And we have just a very brief period of very violent interactions. And what's happened here is that the giant planets became unstable, and actually they ejected some of their members. And during that process, as you can see, all havoc was wreaked on the inner planetary system. So here actually we're just left with one terrestrial planet. It has some water, so that's good for perhaps it being habitable. But as you can see, it has this crazy orbit. So it has an eccentricity of 0.6, and the eccentricity bounces up and down due to interactions, gravitational interactions with this giant planet. So in this way, you can form a terrestrial planet system that looks something very different from the solar system. In particular, you can form very eccentric and very inclined planets this way. You can also completely destroy the inner planetary system if you're not lucky enough to have one planet survive. So again, we've done large numbers of those kinds of simulations and tried to ask how would the predicted properties of the terrestrial planets vary depending on what the giant planets look like. And it works pretty much as you would expect. If you have giant planets that are similar to the solar system, so relatively low mass planets, Jupiter is the most massive planet we have in the solar system, Saturn is the only other significant giant planet we have, that is a relatively stable configuration, and actually you can form terrestrial planets pretty easily in that system. If, on the other hand, you have more massive planets packed closer together, they're more likely to be unstable, and then their dynamical interactions will typically destroy the terrestrial planets in those systems, or at least result in fewer terrestrial planets surviving at the end point of a planet formation. You can actually end up, though, with some very unusual systems. So this is showing oscillations in eccentricity and inclination. So the solar system would be down here with quite dynamically stable systems. You can form here, we think, some quite unusual systems with really quite eccentric and quite inclined orbits. So we're interested to know whether any of those systems exist. So far, none of them have been discovered, but this would be a prediction that if the giant planets are dynamically active, there should be some interesting terrestrial planets with very unusual orbits waiting to be discovered. Now, what about Kepler systems? So more recently, the last few years, the Kepler satellite has discovered a tremendous number, several thousand extrasolar planets, including a lot of planets with quite low masses, or at least small radii, that might be potentially rocky. So here's one representation of the Kepler results. Here's period in days and planetary radius here on the y-axis. This is an Earth radius, this is a Neptune radius, and this is a Jupiter radius. And the colors here are showing how many planets there are in the Kepler-discovered planetary systems. And so what you see here is really tremendously striking. If we now look at small planets, somewhere between the Earth and Neptune size, there is really a tremendous abundance of those planets at very small orbital periods. Okay, so way inside the orbit of Mercury in the solar system. And roughly speaking, the statistics work that maybe something like a third of stars or more have these Kepler planetary systems at these very small orbital periods. So this, of course, poses two obvious challenges for theory. One is that here's a histogram of the distribution of planetary radii. Obviously, this is incomplete at small planetary radii just due to observational effects. But we have a very high abundance of planets that really have radii that are not represented in the solar system at all. Right? In the solar system, we've got nothing between the radius of the Earth and the radius of Neptune. In these Kepler planetary systems, there are many systems which have radii maybe twice the radii of the Earth. So what are those? Are those planets like the Earth, but much more massive, so very large rocky planets? Or are they, if you like, scaled down versions of Uranus and Neptune? And that remains, a big open puzzle. What are most of these planets? And then we just have this property that here's the distribution of the period distribution. There's this very high abundance of very close-in planetary systems. And that's really a puzzle, because if you do a terrestrial planet formation calculation that close to the star, you find that the material would assemble into planets on an exceptionally short timescale. Timescale of maybe 100,000 years, or even less than 100,000 years. So there's basically no way you could sort of put that material there and let it grow into planets, because it would actually have sort of started to grow into planets before you'd actually managed to place it down in that region of the protoplanetary disk. So somehow these Kepler planetary systems really must have formed in some sort of different mode from what we see in the solar system. So we don't know how that happens. Let me just briefly describe my favorite model for this. I think this may be evidence for a mode of planet formation which is dominated by migration, by the radial motion of solid material through the disk to form planets in preferred locations, preferred distances away from the star. So the basic picture would be something like this. Here's the star, we imagine the protoplanetary disk, and what we know now is that within these protoplanetary disks, there are particular locations where the structure of the disk changes rapidly over a short radial length scale. So one of those is associated with the snow line, a place in the disk where we can first form water ice, where it first becomes cold enough to form water ice. Inside that region, we have a water vapor. There are other places, for example, where the disk interacts with the magnetic field of the star, where the temperature in the disk starts to become large enough that the conductivity becomes relatively high. So we think within the protoplanetary disk there are these special locations where there are changes to the structure that would actually act to trap particles which were moving radially through the disk. So what can perhaps happen is that we have solid material in the disk, predominantly at large scales where most of the mass is. It's moving radially through the disk, and then it encounters these particular locations where trapping can occur. So the basic idea would be this material moves in, it encounters these traps, it builds up in these traps, and these traps can then lead to the formation of planetesimals and then very rapid growth into, let's say, terrestrial planets or low-mass planetary cores at those locations. And this is potentially interesting because many of these traps we know about are in the inner part of the planetary system, and so they coincide radially with where we are seeing these rather rich Kepler planetary systems. So one can do some calculations of those that kind of model. Here what I'm showing is the concentration of solid material as a function of distance compared to what it would be in a disk that didn't have these particle traps in its structure. And what you find is that if you can grow objects that are maybe a few millimeters or a few centimeters in size, then these traps are extremely efficient in collecting material together on a relatively narrow length scale. So here the red curves are for 1 centimeter particles. This is some particular disk model. And if you have these traps that are a few tenths of an AU out to a few AU, you can easily get over concentrations of those centimeter-sized objects that are an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude, perhaps even higher than that in the outer disk. So the picture I think is quite appealing, is that the gas disk has some interesting non-trivial structure in it. As solid material is drifting in towards the star through that gas disk, it encounters these particle traps, the material builds up there, and those are the first sites where you can form the planetesimals and subsequently form the planets. How does that work? Well, we think one way it may work is that when you build up a high enough density of solid material compared to the amount of gas you have present there, that introduces new instabilities which can clump that material together very, very rapidly. So that's what's being shown in this simulation here done by Jake Simon, who's a Sagan Fellow in Colorado. This is distance from the star, this is height above the midplane of the disk. The colours here are showing the density of solid particles which are interacting aerodynamically with the gas in the protoplanetary disk. And if you can get to a state where the density, the local density of particles is roughly comparable to the local density of gas, you get this very vigorous clumping instability, it's called streaming instability, which would mean that that would be potentially a preferred site for forming those kilometer-sized objects and then building up to the Kepler planetary systems. So, with a student, with Jacob Bruns, who's a student, we've been going further with that and asking if you do start forming solid material, planetesimals, and if you like rings in preferred locations around the star, does that then produce a planetary system that looks like one of the Kepler planetary systems after the dynamical interactions, the collisions between the planetesimals, and the growth up to terrestrial planet scales? So here's just a few examples of this. These are simulations where we started off with all of the material forming at 0.2 of an AU away from the star, so quite close compared to in the solar system. And here are just some examples of different planetary systems that we form here if we imagine that about 10 Earth masses of solid material is flowing into the inner disk every million years. And you can see you can produce multiple systems here quite easily. Some of those multiple systems start to spread out in orbital radius. As you pile more material in there, the planets start scattering off each other and they start spreading out orbitally in radius from where you initially put the solid material down. So you can form multiple planetary systems quite easily. We don't yet know whether the orbital properties of these simulated systems are in better or worse agreement with the Kepler systems than other models of planet formation that people have proposed for building those Kepler systems. One thing we do see, though, which is interesting but may also be worrying, is that you actually form co-orbital planetary systems quite commonly. So here, you can maybe see there's a sort of bullseye pattern here. Here what you have is 4 planets, but 2 pairs of those planets actually share the same orbit. And so that's an interesting system. That actually turns out to be a very stable system. Nothing wrong with that kind of planetary system. And actually a number of ways people have proposed to make these Kepler planetary systems produce these co-orbital planets quite commonly. And so it's a bit of a puzzle or interesting that actually none of those have yet been observed. So this is work that's in progress. As I say, what we're aiming to look at is whether you do better or worse at producing things that look like what is being seen in that large Kepler sample. So let me finish there with a summary. I think one of the basic questions we have after the discovery of extrasolar planets is, well, where does the solar system fit in within that picture? I think the basic idea we now have is that the solar system has the same planet formation processes as other planetary systems, but it lies in that regime where the giant planets were only moderately dynamically active, and there wasn't that much material close to the sun to produce the terrestrial planets. So that leads to actually the simplest mode of planet formation, where the giant planets basically do one thing, the terrestrial planets form in place and relatively slowly, and so they're not affected by the gas, which by mass dominates over the solids in protoplanetary disks. The extrasolar planetary systems, you can explore the different regions of the parameter space. You can have more active giant planets where you have violent dynamical interactions between those. Those produce the eccentric giant extrasolar planets we see. They may also produce those inclined planets that are very close to the star. And then you can have other disks where there's more mass in, or perhaps migrating through the terrestrial planet region, that forms these close-in Kepler planetary systems, which don't have any analog in the solar system. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Hi Phil, Ramon Brasser, pleased to meet. If you have to define the single biggest open problem right now in planet formation, what would you say that would be?
From a theoretical point of view, I would say it's the formation, how you form planetesimals from millimeter-sized objects. So streaming instability, which I showed that movie of, is one idea for doing that. But that does require some fairly special conditions to operate, and it's not clear that's the right answer. And I think that's central to answering the question of, if you have a protoplanetary disk, do you expect to form planetesimals and ultimately planets at every location within the disk, or just at a few locations? And I think that's still pretty open.
Other questions?
Basically, I have two questions, and the first one is that you mentioned that some gas or particles will be ejected during the planet formation. So I was wondering if the mass of the total system are kind of lost after planet formation. And the second one is that do planet formation have anything to do with dark matter?
Okay, so first question was yes, where the material is ejected. I think generally we expect small material to be ejected from all planetary systems. So things like comets, a lot of comets are going to be ejected pretty much from any planetary system we can envisage. Right? The total amount of mass in those objects is very small. In these models where we have dynamically active giant planets, it's typical to have sort of as many ejections as planets that survive. So roughly we might expect there to be sort of one free-floating planet per planet that's bound. Right? So there's some potential for measuring that with microlensing experiments, and in fact some claims that's been seen, that some of those planets have been seen. Second question, on these scales we really don't expect there to be any influence of dark matter over at all.
So do you think that the photoinfrared can play a role in the formation of the planet, for example, hinder the formation of the planetesimals, or it changes the eccentricity of the already formed planet?
Photoevaporation, yeah. It's a good question. I mean, I think photoevaporation will change the orbital evolution of planets after they've formed through its influence on what it does to the gas disk. Beyond that, I think it doesn't probably have a strong effect, except in sort of more complicated sense that photoevaporation is obviously associated with events that also change the chemistry of the disk, and that will affect planetesimals and so forth. And certainly there were some puzzles. For example, Herschel has makes measurements of water vapor abundance in disks, and those don't agree very well with simple models, and so that probably is saying that what's going on in the surface of the disk, chemistry and photoevaporation, is playing some role that actually we can even observe. Right?
Thank you very much.
So you mentioned about the possibility. In your simulation, you have shown some possibility of the co-orbit planets. So I'm wondering. There are lots of data already. So is that proof to be no such things exist, or is that we just simply overlook in our data analysis?
So I think we maybe separate here transit surveys for planets and radial velocity surveys. So in radial velocity surveys, a co-orbital planet could be quite degenerate with an orbital solution that doesn't involve co-orbital planets. So those surveys don't necessarily tell us anything very definitive. My feeling is that if there were a lot of co-orbital planets, and the radii were not so different, they would have been seen by Kepler. So I think it's a distinctive signature, and it's not very easy to confuse with something else. So I think probably the abundance is physically quite low, and that certainly is a puzzle, because not just in this particular model of Kepler planet formation, but any model where the planets are actually forming within the gas, the presence of dissipation does allow you to form these co-orbital objects, it seems, quite easily. So that's a fairly generic result, it seems.
In your slides, you have mentioned that there is a special system. There are many massive planets, and you also mentioned that there are many mechanisms affect on the orbit of the planets. I'm trying to relate it to these two point of view, and my question is, how important the initial condition of the star forming or initial mass function affect on the planet formation? Yeah.
So I think the thing that matters the most is really, let's say, how much angular momentum the infalling material has, right? Mm-hmm. So particularly in the model where you have gravitational collapse of the disk, we think that will happen if the disk is larger than maybe 50 or 100 AU, depending somewhat on the temperature. So that's basically just a function of how much angular momentum there is in the core. The other thing that's important is how much that can cool, and so how much irradiation there is from the central star, and potentially irradiation from other stars. That will also potentially suppress that. So those are the factors that enter into it, and I think the problem is that of course we see some disks today that are very large, but they're quite low mass. We don't have a very good indication of exactly how much mass and radii there are in those very young disks. There are some estimates that put young disks as having masses comparable to the mass of a star, which would be very favourable to them fragmenting. Probably not in planets in the ground wars, but how common that is and what the uncertainties are large.
More questions? So I'm actually curious about planet formation in a binary stellar system. How would that change the pictures you presented?
Yeah, so of course we see some planets in binaries and around binaries. The main effect, I would say, is that sort of standard picture is that once you get to maybe kilometer-sized objects, collisions between those will lead to accretion. If you're in a binary, the random velocities of those sized objects become larger, and so collisions would actually just break them up again. So the fact that we actually see some planets in those circumstances says something that maybe the initial sizes of objects that are formed are larger than kilometer sizes, so that they can hold together more easily on collision. So probably it says something about that, but